Bushido, The Soul of Japan, by Inazo Nitobe. Chapter 7. Veracity or Truthfulness. Propriety carried beyond right bounds, says Masamune, becomes a lie. An ancient poet has outdone Polonius in the advice he gives: "To thyself be faithful. If in thy heart thou strayest not from truth, without prayer of thine the gods will keep thee whole." The apotheosis of sincerity, to which Tsutsu gives expression in the doctrine of the mean, attributes to it transcendental powers, almost identifying them with the divine. Sincerity is the end and the beginning of all things. Without sincerity there would be nothing. He then dwells with eloquence on its far-reaching and long-enduring nature, its power to produce changes without movement, and by its mere presence to accomplish its purpose without effort. From the Chinese ideogram for sincerity, which is a combination of "word" and "perfect," one is tempted to draw a parallel between it and the Neoplatonic doctrine of Logos, to such height does the sage soar in his unwonted mystic flight. Lying or equivocation were deemed equally cowardly. The Bushi held that his high social position demanded a loftier standard of veracity than that of the tradesman and peasant. Bushi no Ichigon, the word of a samurai, or in exact German equivalent ein Ritterwort, was sufficient guarantee of the truthfulness of an assertion. His word carried such weight with it that promises were generally made and fulfilled without a written pledge, which would have been deemed quite beneath his dignity. Many thrilling anecdotes were told of those who atoned by death for Nigon, a double tongue. The regard for veracity was so high that, unlike the generality of Christians who persistently violate the plain commands of the teacher not to swear, the best of samurai looked upon an oath as derogatory to their honor. I am well aware that they did swear by different deities or upon their swords, but never has swearing degenerated into wanton form and irreverent interjection. To emphasize our words, a practice of literally sealing with blood was sometimes resorted to. For the explanation of such a practice I need only refer my readers to Goethe's Faust. A recent American writer is responsible for this statement, that if you ask an ordinary Japanese which is better, to tell a falsehood or be impolite, he will not hesitate to answer, "To tell a falsehood." Dr. Peary in The Gist of Japan is partly right and partly wrong. Right in that an ordinary Japanese, even a samurai, may answer in the way ascribed to him, but wrong in attributing too much weight to the term he translates falsehood. This word, in Japanese uso, is employed to denote anything which is not a truth, makoto, or fact, honto. Lowell tells us that Wordsworth could not distinguish between truth and fact, and an ordinary Japanese is in this respect as good as Wordsworth. Ask a Japanese, or even an American of any refinement, to tell you whether he dislikes you, or whether he is sick at his stomach, and he will not hesitate long to tell falsehoods and answer, "I like you much," or "I am quite well, thank you." To sacrifice truth merely for the sake of politeness was regarded as an empty form, kyorei, and deception by sweet words, and was never justified. I own I am speaking now of the Bushido idea of veracity, but it may not be amiss to devote a few words to our commercial integrity, of which I have heard much complaint in foreign books and journals. A loose business morality has indeed been the worst blot on our national reputation, but before abusing it or hastily condemning the whole race for it, let us calmly study it, and we shall be rewarded with consolation for the future. Of all the great occupations of life, none was farther removed from the profession of arms than commerce. The merchant was placed lowest in the category of vocations: the knight, the tiller of the soil, the mechanic, the merchant. The samurai derived his income from land and could even indulge, if he had a mind to, in amateur farming, but the counter and abacus were abhorred. We knew the wisdom of this social arrangement. Montesquieu has made it clear that the debarring of the nobility from mercantile pursuits was an admirable social policy, in that it prevented wealth from accumulating in the hands of the powerful. The separation of power and riches kept the distribution of the latter more nearly equable. Professor Dill, the author of Roman Society in the Last Century of the Western Empire, has brought afresh to our mind that one cause of the decadence of the Roman Empire was the permission given to the nobility to engage in trade, and the consequent monopoly of wealth and power by a minority of the senatorial families. Commerce, therefore, in feudal Japan did not reach that degree of development which it would have attained under freer conditions. The obloquy attached to the calling naturally brought within its pale such as cared little for social repute. Call one a chief and he will steal. Put a stigma on a calling and its followers adjust their morals to it, for it is natural that the normal conscience, as Hugh Black says, rises to the demands made on it and easily falls to the limit of the standard expected from it. It is unnecessary to add that no business, commercial or otherwise, can be transacted without a code of morals. Our merchants of the feudal period had one among themselves, without which they could never have developed, as they did, such fundamental mercantile institution as the guild, the bank, the bourse, insurance, checks, bills of exchange, etc. But in their relations with people outside their vocation, the tradesmen lived too true to the reputation of their order. This being the case, when the country was open to foreign trade, only the most adventurous and unscrupulous rushed to the ports, while the respectable business houses declined for some time the repeated requests of the authorities to establish branch houses. Was Bushido powerless to stay the current of commercial dishonor? Let us see. Those who are well acquainted with our history will remember that only a few years after our treaty ports were opened to foreign trade, feudalism was abolished, and when with it the samurai's fiefs were taken and bonds issued to them in compensation, they were given liberty to invest them in mercantile transactions. Now you may ask, why could they not bring their much boasted veracity into their new business relations and so reform the old abuses? Those who had eyes to see could not weep enough, those who had hearts to feel could not sympathize enough, with the fate of many a noble and honest samurai who signally and irrevocably failed in his new and unfamiliar field of trade and industry, through sheer lack of shrewdness in coping with his artful plebeian rival. When we know that 80% of the business houses fail in so industrial a country as America, is it any wonder that scarcely one among 100 samurai who went into trade could succeed in his new vocation? It will be long before it will be recognized how many fortunes were wrecked in the attempt to apply Bushido ethics to business methods, but it was soon patent to every observing mind that the ways of wealth were not the ways of honor. In which respects, then, were they different? Of the three incentives to veracity that Lecky enumerates, that the industrial, the political, and the philosophical, the first was altogether lacking in Bushido. As to the second, it could develop little in a political community under a feudal system. It is in its philosophical, and as Lecky says, in its highest aspect, that honesty attained elevated rank in our catalogue of virtues. With all my sincere regard for the high commercial integrity of the Anglo-Saxon race, when I ask for the ultimate ground, I am told that honesty is the best policy, that it pays to be honest. Is not this virtue, then, its own reward? If it is followed because it brings in more cash than falsehood, I am afraid Bushido would rather indulge in lies. If Bushido rejects a doctrine of quid pro quo rewards, the shrewder tradesman will readily accept it. Lecky has very truly remarked that veracity owes its growth largely to commerce and manufacture. As Nietzsche puts it, honesty is the youngest of virtues. In other words, it is the foster child of industry, of modern industry. Without this mother, Veracity was like a blue-blood orphan whom only the most cultivated mind could adopt and nourish. Such minds were general among the samurai, but, for want of a more democratic and utilitarian foster mother, the tender child failed to thrive. Industries advancing, Veracity will prove an easy, nay, a profitable virtue to practice. Just think, as late as November 1880, Bismarck sent a circular to the professional consuls of the German Empire, warning them of "a lamentable lack of reliability with regard to German shipments inter alia, apparent both as to quality and quantity." Nowadays we hear comparatively little of German carelessness and dishonesty in trade. In 20 years her merchants learned that in the end honesty pays. Already our merchants are finding that out. For the rest, I recommend the reader to two recent writers for well-weighed judgment on this point. Knapp, Feudal and Modern Japan, and Ransom, Japan in Transition. It is interesting to remark in this connection that integrity and honor were the surest guarantees which even a merchant debtor could present in the form of promissory notes. It was quite a usual thing to insert such clauses as these: "In default of the repayment of the sum lent to me, I shall say nothing against being ridiculed in public," or "In case I fail to pay you back, you may call me a fool," and the like. Often have I wondered whether the veracity of Bushido had any motive higher than courage. In the absence of any positive commandment against bearing false witness, lying was not condemned as sin, but simply denounced as weakness, and, as such, highly dishonorable. As a matter of fact, the idea of honesty is so intimately blended, and its Latin and its German etymology so identified with honor, that it is high time I should pause a few moments for the consideration of this feature of the precepts of knighthood. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. Honor. The sense of honor, implying a vivid consciousness of personal dignity and worth, could not fail to characterize the samurai, born and bred to value the duties and privileges of their profession. Though the word ordinarily given nowadays as the translation of honor was not used freely, yet the idea was conveyed by such terms as na, name, menmoku, countenance, guaibun, outside hearing, reminding us respectively of the biblical use of name, of the evolution of the term personality from the Greek mask, and of fame. A good name, one's reputation, the immortal part of one's self, what remains being bestial, assumed as a matter of course. Any infringement upon its integrity was felt as shame, and the sense of shame, ren-chi shin, was one of the earliest to be cherished in juvenile education. You will be laughed at. It will disgrace you. Are you not ashamed? Were the last appeal to correct behavior on the part of a youthful delinquent. Such a recourse to his honor touched the most sensitive spot in the child's heart, as though it had been nursed on honor while it was in its mother's womb, for most truly is honor a prenatal influence, being closely bound up with strong family consciousness. In losing the solidarity of families, says Balzac, society has lost the fundamental force which Montesquieu named honor. Indeed, the sense of shame seems to me to be the earliest indication of the moral consciousness of our race. The first and worst punishment which befell humanity in consequence of tasting the fruit of that forbidden tree was, to my mind, not the sorrow of childbirth, nor the thorns and thistles, but the awakening of the sense of shame. Few incidents in history excel in pathos the scene of the first mother plying with heaving breast and tremulous fingers her crude needle on the few fig leaves which her dejected husband plucked for her. This first fruit of disobedience clings to us with a tenacity that nothing else does. All the sartorial ingenuity of mankind, has not yet succeeded in sewing an apron that will efficaciously hide our sense of shame. That samurai was right who refused to compromise his character by a slight humiliation in his youth, because, he said, dishonor is like a scar on a tree, which time, instead of effacing, only helps to enlarge. Mencius had taught, centuries before, in almost the identical phrase, what Carlyle has latterly expressed, namely, that shame is the soil of all virtue, of good manners and good morals. The fear of disgrace was so great that if our literature lacks such eloquence as Shakespeare puts into the mouth of Norfolk, it nevertheless hung like Damocles' sword over the head of every samurai and often assumed a morbid character. In the name of honor, deeds were perpetrated which can find no justification in the code of Bushido. At the slightest, nay, imaginary insult, the quick-tempered braggart took offense, resorted to the use of the sword, and many an unnecessary strife was raised, and many an innocent life lost. The story of a well-meaning citizen who called the attention of a bushi to a flea jumping on his back, and who was forthwith cut in two for the simple and questionable reason that inasmuch as fleas are parasites which feed on animals, it was an unpardonable insult to identify a noble warrior with a beast, I say, stories like these are too frivolous to believe. Yet the circulation of such stories implies three things. 1. That they were invented to overawe common people. 2. That abuses were really made of the samurai's profession of honor. And 3. That a very strong sense of shame was developed among them. It is plainly unfair to take an abnormal case to cast blame upon the precepts, any more than to judge of the true teaching of Christ from the fruits of religious fanaticism and extravagance, inquisitions and hypocrisy. But, as in religious monomania there is something touchingly noble, as compared with the delirium tremens of a drunkard, so in that extreme sensitiveness of the samurai about their honor, do we not recognize the substratum of a genuine virtue? The morbid excess into which the delicate code of honor was inclined to run was strongly counterbalanced by preaching magnanimity and patience. To take offense at slight provocation was ridiculed as short-tempered. The popular adage said, "To bear what you think you cannot bear is really to bear." The great Ieyasu left to posterity a few maxims, among which are the following: The life of man is like going a long distance with a heavy load upon the shoulders. Haste not. Reproach none, but be forever watchful of thine own shortcomings. Forbearance is the basis of length of days. He proved in his life what he preached. A literary wit put a characteristic epigram into the mouths of three well-known personages in our history. To Nobunaga he attributed, "I will kill her if the nightingale sings not in time." To Hideyoshi, "I will force her to sing for me." And to Ieyasu, "I will wait till she opens her lips." Patience and long-suffering were also highly commended by Mencius. In one place he writes to this effect: "Though you denude yourself and insult me, what is that to me? You cannot defile my soul by your outrage." Elsewhere he teaches that anger at a petty offense is unworthy a superior man, but indignation for a great cause is righteous wrath. To what height of unmartial and unresisting meekness Bushido could reach in some of its votaries may be seen in their utterances. Take, for instance, this saying of Ogawa: "When others speak all manner of evil things against thee, return not evil for evil, but rather reflect that thou wast not more faithful in the discharge of thy duties." Take another of Kumazawa: "When others blame thee, blame them not. When others are angry at thee, return not anger. Joy cometh only as passion and desire part." Still another instance I may cite from Saigo, upon whose overhanging brows "shame is ashamed to sit." The way is the way of heaven and earth. Man's place is to follow it. Therefore make it the object of thy life to reverence heaven. Heaven loves me and others with equal love. Therefore with the love wherewith thou lovest thyself, love others. Make not men thy partner, but heaven. And making heaven thy partner, do thy best. Never condemn others, but see to it that thou comest not short of thine own mark. Some of those sayings remind us of Christian expostulations, and show us how far in practical morality natural religion can approach the revealed. Not only did these sayings remain as utterances, but they were really embodied in acts. It must be admitted that very few attained this sublime height of magnanimity, patience, and forgiveness. It was a great pity that nothing clear and general was expressed as to what constitutes honor, only a few enlightened minds being aware that it "from no condition rises," but that it lies in each acting well his part. For nothing was easier than for youths to forget in the heat of action what they had learned in Mencius in their calmer moments. Said this sage, "'Tis in every man's mind to love honor, but little doth he dream that what is truly honorable lies within himself and not anywhere else. The honor which men confer is not good honor. Those whom Chao the Great ennobles, he can make mean again." For the most part, an insult was quickly resented and repaid by death, as we shall see later, while honor, too often nothing higher than vainglory or worldly approbation, was prized as the summum bonum of earthly existence. Fame, and not wealth or knowledge, was the goal toward which youth set to strive. Many a lad swore within himself as he crossed the threshold of his paternal home, that he would not recross it until he had made a name in the world, and many an ambitious mother refused to see her sons again unless they could "return home," as the expression is, caparisoned in brocade. To shun shame or win a name, samurai boys would submit to any privations and undergo severest ordeals of bodily or mental suffering. They knew that honor won in youth grows with age. In the memorable siege of Osaka, a young son of Ieyasu, in spite of his earnest entreaties to be put in the vanguard, was placed at the rear of the army. When the castle fell, he was so chagrined and wept so bitterly that an old counselor tried to console him with all the resources at his command. "Take comfort, sire," said he, "at thought of the long future before you. In the many years that you may live, there will come divers occasions to distinguish yourself." The boy fixed his indignant gaze upon the man and said, "How foolishly you talk! Can ever my 14th year come round again?" Life itself was thought cheap if honor and fame could be attained therewith. Hence, whenever a cause presented itself which was considered dearer than life, with utmost serenity and celerity was life laid down. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9. The Duty of Loyalty. Of the causes in comparison with which no life was too dear to sacrifice was the duty of loyalty, which was the keystone making feudal virtues a symmetrical arch. Other virtues feudal morality shares in common with other systems of ethics, with other classes of people, but this virtue, homage and fealty to a superior, is its distinctive feature. I am aware that personal fidelity is a moral adhesion existing among all sorts and conditions of men. A gang of pickpockets owe allegiance to a Fagin, but it is only in the code of chivalrous honor that loyalty assumes paramount importance. In spite of Hegel's criticism that the fidelity of feudal vassals, being an obligation to an individual and not to a commonwealth, is a bond established on totally unjust principles, a great compatriot of his made it his boast that personal loyalty was a German virtue. Bismarck had good reason to do so, not because the Treue he boasts of was the monopoly of his fatherland or of any single nation or race, but because this favored fruit of chivalry lingers latest among the people where feudalism has lasted longest. In America, where everybody is as good as anybody else, and, as the Irishman added, better too, such exalted ideas of loyalty as we feel for our sovereign may be deemed excellent within certain bounds, but preposterous as encouraged among us. Montesquieu complained long ago that right on one side of the Pyrenees was wrong on the other, and the recent Dreyfus trial proved the truth of his remark, save that the Pyrenees were not the sole boundary beyond which French justice finds no accord. Similarly, loyalty as we conceive it may find few admirers elsewhere, not because our conception is wrong, but because it is, I am afraid, forgotten, and also because we carry it to a degree not reached in any other country. Griffiths was quite right in stating in Religions of Japan that whereas in China Confucian ethics made obedience to parents the primary human duty, in Japan precedence was given to loyalty. At the risk of shocking some of my good readers, I will relate of one who could endure to follow a fallen lord, and who thus, as Shakespeare assures, earned a place in the story. The story is of one of the purest characters in our history, Michizane, who, falling a victim to jealousy and calumny, is exiled from the capital. Not content with this, his unrelenting enemies are now bent upon the extinction of his family. Strict search for his son, not yet grown, reveals the fact of his being secreted in a village school kept by one Genzo, a former vassal of Michizane. When orders are dispatched to the schoolmaster to deliver the head of the juvenile offender on a certain day, his first idea is to find a suitable substitute for it. He ponders over his school list, scrutinizes with careful eyes all the boys as they stroll into the classroom, but none among the children born of the soil bears the least resemblance to his protégé. His despair, however, is but for a moment, for, behold, a new scholar is announced, a comely boy of the same age as his master's son, escorted by a mother of noble mien. No less conscious of the resemblance between infant lord and infant retainer were the mother and the boy himself. In the privacy of home both had laid themselves upon the altar, the one his life, the other her heart, yet without sign to the outer world. Unwitting of what had passed between them, it is the teacher from whom comes the suggestion. Here, then, is the scapegoat. The rest of the narrative may be briefly told. On the day appointed arrives the officer commissioned to identify and receive the head of the youth. Will he be deceived by the false head? The poor Genzo's hand is on the hilt of the sword, ready to strike a blow either at the man or at himself, should the examination defeat his scheme. The officer takes up the gruesome object before him, goes calmly over each feature, and in a deliberate, business-like tone, pronounces it genuine. That evening in a lonely home awaits the mother we saw in the school. Does she know the fate of her child? It is not for his return that she watches with eagerness for the opening of the wicket. Her father-in-law has been for a long time a recipient of Michizane's bounties, but since his banishment, circumstances have forced her husband to follow the service of the enemy of his family's benefactor. He himself could not be untrue to his own cruel master, but his son could serve the cause of the grandsire's lord. As one acquainted with the exile's family, it was he who had been entrusted with the task of identifying the boy's head. Now the day's, the life's, hard work is done. He returns home, and as he crosses its threshold, he accosts his wife, saying, "Rejoice, my wife! Our darling son has proved of service to his lord." "What an atrocious story!" I hear my readers exclaim. "Parents deliberately sacrificing their own innocent child to save the life of another man's." But this child was a conscious and willing victim. It is a story of vicarious death, as significant as, and not more revolting than, the story of Abraham's intended sacrifice of Isaac. In both cases it was obedience to the call of duty, utter submission to the command of a higher voice, whether given by a visible or an invisible angel, or heard by an outward or an inward ear. But I abstain from preaching. The individualism of the West, which recognizes separate interests for father and son, husband and wife, necessarily brings into strong relief the duties owed by one to the other. But Bushido held that the interest of the family and of the members thereof is intact, one and inseparable. This interest it bound up with affection, natural, instinctive, irresistible. Hence, if we die for one we love with natural love, which animals themselves possess, what is that? For if ye love them that love you, what reward have ye? Do not even the publicans the same? In his great history, Sanyo relates in touching language the hard struggle of Shigemori concerning his father's rebellious conduct. If I be loyal, my father must be undone. If I obey my father, my duty to my sovereign must go amiss. Poor Shigemori! We see him afterward praying with all his soul that kind heaven may visit him with death, that he may be released from this world where it is hard for purity and righteousness to dwell. Many a Shigemori has his heart torn by the conflict between duty and affection. Indeed, neither Shakespeare nor the Old Testament itself contains an adequate rendering of Ko, our conception of filial piety, and yet in such conflicts Bushido never wavered in its choice of loyalty. Women, too, encouraged their offspring to sacrifice all for the king. Ever as resolute as Widow Windham and her illustrious consort, the samurai matron stood ready to give up her boys for the cause of loyalty. Since Bushido, like Aristotle and some modern sociologists, conceived the state as antedating the individual, the latter being born into the former as part and parcel thereof, he must live and die for it, or for the incumbent of its legitimate authority. Readers of Crito will remember the argument with which Socrates represents the laws of the city as pleading with him on the subject of his escape. Among others he makes them, the laws, or the state, say, "Since you were begotten and nurtured and educated under us, dare you once to say you are not our offspring and servant, you and your fathers before you?" These are words which do not impress us as anything extraordinary, for the same thing has long been on the lips of Bushido, with this modification that the laws and the state were represented with us by a personal being. Loyalty is an ethical outcome of this political theory. I am not entirely ignorant of Mr. Spencer's view according to which political obedience, loyalty, is accredited with only a transitional function. It may be so. Sufficient unto the day is the virtue thereof. We may complacently repeat it, especially as we believe that day to be a long space of time, during which, so our national anthem says, tiny pebbles grow into mighty rocks draped with moss. We may remember at this juncture that even among so democratic a people as the English, the sentiment of personal fidelity to a man and his posterity which their Germanic ancestors felt for their chiefs has, as M. Boutmy recently said, only passed more or less into their profound loyalty to the race and blood of their princes, as evidenced in their extraordinary attachment to the dynasty. Political subordination, Mr. Spencer predicts, will give place to loyalty to the dictates of conscience. Suppose his induction is realized. Will loyalty and its concomitant instinct of reverence disappear forever? We transfer our allegiance from one master to another, without being unfaithful to either. From being subjects of a ruler that wields the temporal scepter we become servants of the monarch who sits enthroned in the penetralia of our heart. A few years ago, a very stupid controversy, started by the misguided disciples of Spencer, made havoc among the reading class of Japan. In their zeal to uphold the claim of the throne to undivided loyalty, they charged Christians with treasonable propensities in that they avow fidelity to their lord and master. They arrayed forth sophistical arguments without the wit of sophists, and scholastic tortuosities minus the niceties of the schoolmen. Little did they know that we can, in a sense, serve two masters without holding to the one or despising the other. rendering unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. Did not Socrates, all the while he unflinchingly refused to concede one iota of loyalty to his demon, obey with equal fidelity and equanimity the command of his earthly master, the State? His conscience he followed, alive; his country he served, dying. Alack the day when a State grows so powerful as to demand of its citizens the dictates of their conscience! Bushido did not require us to make our conscience the slave of any lord or king. Thomas Mowbray was a veritable spokesman for us when he said, "Myself I throw, dread sovereign, at thy foot. My life thou shalt command, but not my shame. The one my duty owes, but my fair name, despite of death, that lives upon my grave, to dark dishonor's use, thou shalt not have." A man who sacrificed his own conscience to the capricious will or freak or fancy of a sovereign was accorded a low place in the estimate of the Precepts. Such an one was despised as Nei Shin, a cringeling, who makes court by unscrupulous fawning, or as Choshin, a favorite who steals his master's affections by means of servile compliance. These two species of subjects corresponding exactly to those which Iago describes: the one, a duteous and knee-crooking knave, doting on his own obsequious bondage, wearing out his time much like his master's ass; the other, trimmed in forms and visages of duty, keeping yet his heart attending on himself. When a subject differed from his master, the loyal path for him to pursue was to use every available means to persuade him of his error, as Kent did to King Lear. Failing in this, let the master deal with him as he wills. In cases of this kind, it was quite the usual course for the samurai to make the last appeal to the intelligence and conscience of his lord by demonstrating the sincerity of his words with the shedding of his own blood. End of chapter 9.